Everyone talks about BMF. Nobody talks about the men who taught BMF everything. You have watched the Stars show. You have heard the rap songs. You have seen the documentaries. You know the names Demetrius Flannery and Terry Flannery. You know Big Meech. You know Southwest T. You think you know Detroit. You think you know where the story starts. You are wrong. Not because you're not paying attention. You are wrong because the people who told you the story started it in the wrong decade. They started it in the wrong neighborhood. They started it with the wrong names. The real story, the original blueprint, the founding document of Detroit's drug empire, was written before BMF existed. It was written before most of BMF's members were old enough to drive. It was written on the east side of Detroit in the late 1970s by a group of young men who looked at a broken, chaotic, violent drug trade and saw something nobody else saw. They did not see crime. They saw inefficiency. They did not see a corner. They saw an organization waiting to be built. Their names were Milton Jones, Dwayne Davis, Raymond Peoples, and others whose story's history has almost entirely buried. And what they built was called Young Boys Incorporated. Federal agents, men who had spent careers studying organized crime, men who had taken down mob families, men who had dismantled operations across multiple cities, sat across from each other in FBI briefing rooms and said words they never expected to say about a drug organization run by young men from Detroit's east side. They said, "This crew is unusually well organized for anything we have seen at the street level in this city." And they meant it. In this video, you're going to learn the full story. You're going to learn how a group of young men with no business school education, no venture capital, and no legitimate pathway built the most organized criminal operation Detroit had ever seen. You're going to learn how that organization ran for years before the government figured out how to fight it. You're going to learn what happened when it fell. And you're going to learn how the organizational lessons of the YBI era shaped every major Detroit drug organization that came after, including, eventually, BMF. BMF did not create Detroit's drug empire. They inherited its lessons. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you're sitting right now? Drop in the comments. Now, if you're someone who believes that untold stories deserve to be told properly, hit like right now. Share this with one person in your life who thinks they know Detroit history. One person who watched BMF on Stars and thinks the story started there. Send it to them. Let them find out where it actually started. And if you're new here, subscribe right now. Because this channel exists for one reason. We find the stories that did not get the show. We find the stories that did not get the documentary deal. We find the stories that history buried under more famous names. And we tell them properly. Subscribe. Turn the notification bell on, because you do not want to miss what comes next. Alright, we're done with the setup. Let's go back to Detroit where it actually started. Let's go back to a city that was breaking apart at the seams, and the extraordinary, complicated, tragic thing that grew out of that brokenness. To understand Young Boys Incorporated, you first have to understand Detroit. Not the Detroit of the 2000s. Not the Detroit of bankruptcy and empty buildings that got turned into art installations and Netflix documentaries about urban decay. Not the Detroit that became a symbol of everything that could go wrong with an American city. You have to understand Detroit in the specific, urgent, painful years of the 1970s. Because what happened in Detroit in that decade created the exact conditions, economic, political, social, geographic, that made YBI not just possible, but almost inevitable. Detroit in 1970 was still, technically, one of the great American cities. It had been the engine of American manufacturing for decades. The auto industry, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, had turned Detroit into a place where a man with no college education could walk onto a factory floor, join a union, and earn enough money to buy a house, raise children, and retire with a pension. For Black Americans especially, Detroit represented something rare and precious in mid-20th century America. It represented access. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of black families from the Deep South to Detroit between the 1910s and the 1960s, and many of them had found something in Detroit that they could not find in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia. They had found work, real work, dignified work, work that paid enough to build a life. By 1970, Detroit's black population was approximately 660,000 people, roughly 44% of the city's total population. A significant portion of those families had built genuine stability through factory work. They owned their homes. They sent their children to school. They participated in civic life. They built churches, businesses, and community institutions on the east side and on the near west side that made those neighborhoods into real communities, not just places where poor people happened to live. Then the bottom fell out. The collapse did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one accelerating the damage of the one before it. The first blow was the 1967 Detroit Rebellion, one of the most destructive urban uprisings in American history. 5 days of unrest that left 43 people dead, more than 1,000 injured, over 2,000 buildings destroyed, and a city psychologically fractured in ways that would take generations to even begin to heal. The rebellion was not the cause of Detroit's decline. It was a symptom of tensions that had been building for decades: police brutality, housing segregation, economic exclusion, and the specific rage of a community that had been systematically denied full participation in the prosperity it had helped to build. But the rebellion accelerated white flight in a way that reshaped the city's geography permanently. Between 1967 and 1980, the city of Detroit lost approximately 500,000 white residents to the suburbs. That is not a typo. 500,000 people. They took their tax dollars, their businesses, their consumer spending, and their political connections to places like Dearborn and Warren and Grosse Pointe, suburban communities that drew hard lines, some of them literally legal lines, to keep black Detroit out. What was left inside the city limits was a population that was increasingly black, increasingly poor, and increasingly abandoned by the institutions, financial, governmental, commercial, that any community needs to survive. The second blow was the oil crisis of 1973. When OPEC imposed its oil embargo and gas prices spiked, American consumers suddenly stopped buying the large, gas-guzzling vehicles that Detroit's auto industry had been built around. Demand for Detroit's primary product collapsed almost overnight. The big three, Ford, GM, Chrysler, responded the way American corporations always respond to declining revenue. They cut costs. They closed plants. They laid off workers. And because the union contracts and seniority systems that protected workers were built around a logic of continuous growth rather than managed decline, the layoffs hit newest and youngest workers first, which, in practice, meant they hit black workers first, because black workers had been the last ones hired during the civil rights era expansion and were therefore the first ones cut when contraction came. By 1975, unemployment in Detroit's black neighborhoods had reached levels that researchers would later compare to the Great Depression. The official unemployment rate in some East Side zip codes exceeded 30%. The unofficial rate, counting people who had stopped looking for work, people working off the books, people surviving through informal economies, was almost certainly higher. Young black men in their late teens and early 20s were facing a labor market that had essentially closed to them. The factories that had employed their fathers were either shutting down, automating, or moving to suburbs and rural areas where land was cheaper and unions were weaker. The service sector jobs that would eventually replace manufacturing employment had not yet arrived in any significant way. The educational institutions that might have provided pathways to different kinds of work were underfunded, overcrowded, and struggling with the same fiscal crisis that was hollowing out every Detroit city service. This is the economic landscape into which the founders of Young Boys Incorporated were born and raised. This is the world that greeted young black men on Detroit's east side when they asked the most basic human question: how do I make a living? Now, add the political dimension, because it matters. In 1973, Coleman Young was elected mayor of Detroit. He was the first black mayor in the city's history, and his election was genuinely historic. Young was a tough, brilliant, complicated man who had been a labor organizer, a civil rights activist, and a state senator. He had been targeted by the House Un-American Activities Committee during the McCarthy era and had faced down the committee's investigators with a defiance that became legendary in Detroit's black community. His election represented a genuine shift in political power. For the first time, black Detroiters controlled City Hall. But Coleman Young inherited a city that was already in serious financial trouble, and his ability to reverse its decline was limited by forces far larger than any mayor could control. The tax base was shrinking as middle-class residents and businesses left. The state and federal governments, controlled by officials who had little political incentive to rescue a majority black city, were reducing aid rather than increasing it. Young made choices that his critics, both at the time and in retrospect, argued accelerated decline rather than reversing it. His relationship with the police department was complicated and contentious from the beginning. The Detroit Police Department in the early 1970s was dominated by a unit that had become notorious throughout the city. It was called STRESS, an acronym that stood for Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. STRESS was created in 1971 as a plainclothes decoy unit designed to reduce street crime by having officers pose as robbery targets and arrest anyone who took the bait. In practice, STRESS became something very different. The unit operated with minimal oversight. Its officers were almost exclusively white, patrolling neighborhoods that were almost exclusively black. Between 1971 and 1973, STRESS officers killed 22 people, an extraordinary number for a unit of its size. The overwhelming majority of those killed were black men. Detroit's black community did not experience STRESS as a crime-fighting tool. They experienced it as an occupying force. Coleman Young made the disbanding of STRESS one of his central campaign promises. He kept that promise within weeks of taking office in January 1974. STRESS was gone. What Young and his supporters did not fully anticipate, or perhaps could not prevent, was the practical effect of removing the most aggressive street-level law enforcement presence from neighborhoods where street-level crime was already a serious problem. Disbanding STRESS did not make Detroit's East Side safer in any immediate, measurable way. What it did was create a shift in the enforcement landscape. The brutal, unconstitutional, deadly tactics of STRESS were gone. But so was the constant, aggressive, visible police presence that had, whatever its costs, served as a deterrent to certain kinds of open street activity. The space that opened up was noticed by people who were paying attention. And some of the people paying attention were very, very young and very, very ambitious. Now, add the drug dimension, because without it the rest of the story makes no sense. Heroin had been devastating American cities since at least the 1950s. Detroit was not immune. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, heroin addiction was a serious public health crisis in Detroit's black neighborhoods. The supply chains that brought heroin into American cities were already well established, connecting poppy fields in Southeast Asia and Southwest Asia through international trafficking networks to American port cities and then to distribution points in major urban areas. Detroit received its heroin primarily through Chicago connections, though the specific supply relationships shifted over time. What the heroin trade in Detroit lacked, absolutely and completely, in the early to mid-1970s, was organization. The distribution of heroin at the street level in Detroit was fragmented into dozens of independent operations. Individual dealers, small crews, loose collections of people who knew each other from the neighborhood. There was no coordination. There was no territory management. There was no quality control. There was no financial discipline. Dealers robbed each other constantly. Violence over corners and customers was chronic and unpredictable. The police, even after STRESS, could manage this landscape through the simple tactic of arresting individual dealers because there was no organization to survive the loss of any individual. This fragmentation had economic consequences that a person with a sharp mind could see immediately. Because there was no coordination, there was constant price competition that drove revenues down. Because there was no territory management, there was constant violence that drove costs up, in bodies, in police attention, in fear that made customers go elsewhere. Because there was no quality control, product consistency was unpredictable, which made customer loyalty impossible. The entire operation was wildly inefficient, and anyone paying close enough attention could see it. Detroit's east side in the mid-1970s was a specific geography that needs to be understood. The east side was, and remains, a large swath of the city running roughly from Woodward Avenue east of the city limits and from the river north to 8 Mile Road. Within that geography, specific neighborhoods had specific characters. There were neighborhoods that had been solidly middle class as recently as the early 1960s and had declined sharply through the combination of white flight, disinvestment, and the departure of the economic institutions that had sustained them. There were neighborhoods that had always been poor and had simply gotten poorer. The streets had names that would later become infamous in the story of Detroit's drug trade. Mack Avenue, Harper Avenue, East Warren, Gresham, Jefferson. These were the corridors along which the heroin trade flowed. The housing stock on Detroit's east side was primarily single-family homes and two-family flats built in the early to mid-20th century. As population declined and economic stress increased, vacancy rates rose. Abandoned houses became a feature of the landscape. Places where people without options went to use drugs, where dealers stored product, where a young man who needed to stay out of sight could disappear. The physical environment of Detroit's east side in the 1970s was, in the most literal sense, a landscape of abandonment and opportunity, depending entirely on who you were and what you were looking for. The schools on the east side were under the same fiscal pressure as every other city institution. Detroit Public Schools was dealing with declining enrollment as families left, declining funding as the tax base shrank, and the enormous social challenges that come with teaching children who are growing up in concentrated poverty. Teachers were doing their best, but the system was not designed to handle what it was being asked to handle. Into this world, this specific, documented, historically verifiable world of economic collapse, political transition, law enforcement upheaval, fragmented drug trade, and geographic abandonment, walked a group of young men with minds and ambitions that the legitimate economy had no use for. They were about to build something the East Side had never seen. The story of Young Boys Incorporated does not begin with one man. That is the first thing you need to understand. And it is something that popular accounts of Detroit's drug history consistently get wrong. Collapsing a collective founding into a single kingpin narrative, because single kingpin narratives are easier to tell and easier to sell. The real founding of YBI was messier, more collective, and in some ways more remarkable than the lone genius version of the story. Because what it took to build YBI was not one extraordinary mind. It was a shared observation made by multiple young men at roughly the same time about the same broken landscape. The names that the documented record, court filings, federal prosecution documents, Detroit Free Press investigative reporting, law enforcement case summaries, consistently places at the center of YBI's founding are these: Milton Butch Jones, Dwayne Wonderful Wayne Davis, Raymond Baby Ray Peoples, and others whose specific roles and identities were documented in legal proceedings, but whose full stories have not yet received the public examination they deserve. These were young men from Detroit's east side. They came of age in exactly the world described in the previous section. The world of closing factories, disappearing jobs, underfunded schools, and a drug trade that was present in their neighborhoods, but had not yet found any organizational discipline. They were not men of unusual formal education. They were not men who had access to business schools or management consultants or the professional networks through which organizational knowledge typically flows in the legitimate world. They were men who had something more immediate and more hard-won than formal education. They had direct, street-level experience of how the existing drug trade operated and an acute, practical awareness of how badly it was operating. What they saw, looking at Detroit's East Side heroin market in the late 1970s, was an industry making a fraction of what it could make because it could not organize itself. Dealers competed violently for corners that all of them together could have managed more profitably through coordination. Workers stole from their suppliers because there was no accountability structure that made theft more dangerous than profitable. Product quality varied wildly because there was no supply chain discipline to enforce consistency. Violence attracted police. Police disrupted sales. Disrupted sales meant lost revenue. Lost revenue meant more desperate behavior, which meant more violence, which meant more police. It was a cycle that destroyed value at every turn. The insight that drove the founding of YBI was not a revelation that fell from the sky. It was a logical conclusion drawn from close observation of a broken system by people who were living inside that system and had strong financial incentives to fix it. The conclusion was this: organize it, build a structure, define territories, and enforce them through the organization rather than through personal violence. Pay workers a reliable wage so they have a reason to be loyal rather than a reason to steal. Manage the supply chain tightly enough to ensure consistent product. Create a hierarchy with clear lines of authority and clear accountability. Make the organization durable enough to survive the arrest of any individual member. These ideas were not invented in a vacuum. They drew on what the founders had observed, the way that legitimate businesses organized themselves, the way that other criminal organizations they knew about or had heard of operated. The specific organizational model they built was their own construction, adapted to the specific circumstances of Detroit's East Side heroin market. But the underlying organizational logic was not mysterious. It was the logic of any functional institution. Structure over chaos. Accountability over impunity. Durability over dependence on individuals. The name Young Boys Incorporated was not accidental. Every word in that name was intentional. Young Boys was a declaration of demographics and identity. These were young men from the East Side, from the communities that the legitimate economy had abandoned. It was a statement of who they were and where they came from. There was no attempt to hide behind a neutral corporate identity. They were young. They were from these streets. They were not pretending otherwise. Incorporated was the deliberate provocation. That word is a legal term. It appears at the end of company names. It signals formal structure, legal entity status, organizational continuity beyond any individual. It was a message sent simultaneously to potential recruits, to competitors, to suppliers, and eventually to the law enforcement agents who would come after them. We are not a crew. We are not a gang. We are an organization. We have structure. We operate by rules we wrote. And those rules are designed to make us last. That psychological self-conception, as an organization rather than a gang, as businessmen rather than criminals, mattered enormously for how YBI recruited, how it enforced internal discipline, and how it managed its relationship with the surrounding community. The people who built it believed they were building something institutional. That belief shaped what they actually built. The founding of YBI is placed by most sources in the late 1970s, with different accounts pointing to different specific years between 1977 and 1979. The organization began on Detroit's East Side, in the neighborhoods where its founders had grown up and where their relationships, knowledge, and street credibility gave them a foundation to build from. It began small. The initial structure was necessarily modest: a handful of trusted associates, a defined territory, a supply relationship, a set of operational rules that distinguished this crew from the fragmented, chaotic operations around it. What made the difference from the beginning was the organizational discipline. From the first days of YBI's operation, the founders imposed expectations that were simply different from anything else on the East Side. You showed up when you were supposed to show up. You handled your territory according to the organization's rules, not your personal preferences. You did not steal from the organization. And unlike other operations, where this was a rule in name only, YBI had systems for enforcing it. You resolved conflicts through the organization's processes rather than through personal violence. You were accountable to a management structure, and that management structure was accountable upward. This organizational discipline created a competitive advantage that was immediately visible in operational performance. YBI's territories were more productive than comparable non-YBI territories because they operated without the constant disruption of internal conflict and random violence. YBI supply relationships were more reliable because the organization honored its commitments consistently. YBI's workers were more dependable because the wage system gave them a financial stake in the organization's continued operation. The organization grew. It grew because it worked better than the alternatives. It grew because young men on the East Side who were looking at their options, a collapsed legitimate labor market on one side, a chaotic and dangerous informal drug economy on the other, saw YBI as a structured, reliable, relatively predictable option in a landscape of chaos and unpredictability. It grew because the founders recruited aggressively, identifying talent on the street with the same operational instinct that the founders themselves had demonstrated. It grew because the organizational model was genuinely replicable across new territories in a way that less structured operations could not be. And in the mid to late 1980s, as the organization had grown into something significant, new figures would rise to prominence within and around its orbit. Figures like Demetrius Holloway, a man whose name the East Side came to know well, whose role in the cocaine distribution that marked YBI's later years was documented in federal proceedings, and whose story exists as one chapter in a longer organizational history, rather than as the organization's founding act. Holloway was not where YBI started. He was part of where it went. That distinction matters. It matters for accuracy. It matters for giving the real founders their due. And it matters for understanding how an organization evolves over time. How what begins as one thing, built by specific people with specific visions, changes as it grows and as new people enter it and shape its direction. The founders of YBI built exactly the kind of organization that the legitimate world claims to value. They identified a market failure. They designed a structural solution. They built an institution that was unusually well organized for a street-level drug crew of that era. They created employment in a community where employment had largely ceased to exist in any legitimate form. The fact that all of this was applied to heroin distribution rather than to any legitimate enterprise is the tragedy of the story. And the tragedy is systemic before it is individual. They built what the environment made available to build. And what they built was unlike anything Detroit's East Side had seen before them. This is the section that changes how you understand everything that came before it and everything that comes after. Most crime documentaries give you drama. They give you shootouts and betrayals and money and flash. What they almost never give you is the actual mechanics. How the thing worked, day to day, dollar to dollar, decision to decision. The mechanics of YBI are what make it historically significant. The mechanics are what made federal agents reach for language about unusual organizational sophistication rather than treating it as a routine street gang takedown. The mechanics are what allowed YBI to operate at a scale and for a duration that no previous Detroit drug organization had achieved. So let's go inside the machine. Young Boys Incorporated operated with a genuine organizational hierarchy. Not a loose collection of people who vaguely deferred to whoever was most intimidating. A real hierarchy with defined levels, defined responsibilities, and defined channels of communication and authority. At the top was the founding leadership, Jones, Davis, Peoples, and their most trusted associates. Their role in the organization was strategic rather than operational. They did not stand on corners. They did not handle product directly. They made decisions about organization-wide strategy, territory expansion, supplier relationships, management personnel, financial systems. Their job was to think about the organization as a whole and make decisions that serve the organization's long-term stability. Below leadership was a layer of senior managers, people who had demonstrated both reliability and operational capacity and had been elevated to positions of responsibility for specific geographic areas or specific functions. These senior managers translated leadership decisions into operational instructions. They managed the people below them. They were responsible for the performance of their areas and reported performance upward through the chain. Below the senior managers were what we might call middle managers. People responsible for specific corners, specific blocks, specific customer relationships. These were the people who supervised street-level workers, managed product inventory at the territory level, collected revenue, and handled the day-to-day operational challenges that arose constantly in a business conducted in public under legal pressure in a competitive environment. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the street-level workers, the people who interacted directly with customers, who stood on corners in all weather, who handled the most visible and most legally exposed work in the entire operation. These workers were predominantly young, sometimes very young, a fact that will be addressed in full in a later section because it is one of the most disturbing aspects of YBI's operation. Their job was straightforward: sell product, collect money, don't cause problems. What made this hierarchy function was not just its structure, but its discipline. Authority moved in clearly defined directions. Instructions came down. Reports and revenue moved up. There were established protocols for handling common situations: supply shortages, customer conflicts, police pressure, worker discipline issues. Workers knew what was expected of them. Managers knew what they were responsible for. The organization had a quality that made it stand apart from every other crew operating on Detroit's east side at the time. Everybody knew their role. Here is the single most remarkable operational feature of Young Boys Incorporated. The thing that, when you explain it to people who have studied criminal organizations, makes them lean forward. YBI paid its street-level workers' wages. Not a percentage of sales. Not a cut of the action. Actual wages. Regular pay. You showed up, you worked your shift, you got paid. Like an employee. Like a job. This sounds simple. In the context of Detroit's drug trade in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was a genuine departure from how everything else worked. Every other drug operation in Detroit at the time operated on some form of consignment or commission model. Workers received product and kept a percentage of what they sold. This model has an obvious appeal. It aligns the worker's financial incentive with sales volume, which theoretically maximizes effort. But it has serious structural problems that YBI's founders identified and eliminated through the wage system. The consignment model creates a constant temptation to steal. If a worker holds product and sells it, keeping a percentage, the worker has the physical opportunity to sell product and claim it was stolen, or to cut the product and pocket the difference, or to simply disappear with a consignment and never come back. These things happen constantly in Detroit's non-YBI drug operations. The loss rate from worker theft was significant and chronic. The wage model eliminates this temptation almost entirely. When you're being paid a regular wage, you do not hold product in a way that creates theft opportunity in the same way. The product flows through you, you sell it, you turn the money over, you get your wage. Your financial relationship is with the organization as an employer, not with the product as an asset you are managing for commission. The wage model also created something that commission structures almost never create in illegal enterprises. It created loyalty. A worker who is paid a regular wage, who can depend on that payment, who has a reliable income from their position in the organization. That worker has a reason to protect the organization. The organization is their income. Threatening it threatens them. This is the same logic that makes employment create organizational loyalty in legitimate businesses. YBI had translated that logic into its own context. Additionally, the wage model created operational predictability. Leadership knew what labor cost. They could plan. The financial model of the operation was not dependent on variable individual performance in the way that commission structures are. It was a more stable, more plannable labor model. Federal prosecutors who later examined YBI's financial records were struck by the relative consistency of the wage structure. Workers were being paid set amounts for set periods of work. The financial records that YBI maintained internally, records that the organization kept for its own management purposes, showed payment structures that reflected genuine operational discipline, not the chaotic cash flows of a typical street-level operation. YBI's approach to geographic territory was another area where organizational thinking replaced the chaotic competition that characterized Detroit's drug trade before its rise. The founders divided YBI's operational area, which centered on Detroit's east side, but expanded significantly over time, into defined territories. Each territory was assigned to a specific management team with clear responsibility for that territory's performance. Territories were not up for grabs. They were allocated by the organization's leadership, and that allocation was enforced. This had several effects that were all operationally beneficial. First, it eliminated the constant territorial violence that had characterized the pre-YBI Detroit drug trade. When territories are clearly defined and organizationally enforced, workers do not fight over corners, because fighting over corners is not how territory is allocated. Territory comes from above. If you want more territory, you make your case to management. You do not shoot the person on the next block. Second, it created accountability. If a territory was underperforming, generating less revenue than its potential, experiencing more police problems than it should, losing customers to competitors, the management team responsible for that territory was accountable. Management could diagnose the problem, replace personnel, adjust strategy, reallocate resources. The territory was an asset of the organization, managed by designated people who were accountable for its performance. Third, it allowed for systematic expansion. When YBI decided to expand into new geographic areas, it did so in an organized way, assessing the opportunity, assigning management, establishing operational protocols, and integrating the new territory into the existing organizational structure. This is not how street gangs expand. YBI expanded with a plan. YBI's heroin came primarily from suppliers with connections to national and international distribution networks. The specific supply relationships changed over time, but what distinguished YBI's approach to supply was its emphasis on consistency and volume. The founders understood that product quality was a customer retention issue. Inconsistent product drove customers away. Consistent, reliable product created loyal customers who came back. YBI negotiated supply relationships at a level that most Detroit operations could not access because most Detroit operations were too small and too disorganized to be serious trading partners for major suppliers. YBI's volume and reliability made it a significant customer, which gave it some leverage in supplier negotiations. This is basic supply chain logic. More organized buyers get better terms. YBI was more organized than anyone else in Detroit, and that organizational advantage translated directly into a supply chain advantage. YBI generated revenue that required genuine management. Court records and FBI financial analyses from the eventual prosecution document what federal prosecutors described as tens of millions of dollars annually at its peak. Numbers that, even accounting for the significant overhead costs of running a large organization in an illegal industry, represented substantial income for the organization's leadership. That money could not simply sit in bank accounts. Cash generated by illegal activity is a liability as well as an asset. It is evidence of the criminal enterprise, and it attracts attention from both law enforcement and other criminals. YBI developed approaches to managing and moving money that reflected the same operational discipline as every other aspect of its operation. Some of the money was reinvested in the organization, in worker wages, in supply purchases, in the operational costs of running a territory system across a large geographic area. Some was used to purchase assets, cars, jewelry, real estate, that functioned both as stores of value and as displays of the organization's power and prosperity. Some moved through the informal financial networks that have always served as alternatives to the formal banking system for people and activities that the formal system excludes or investigates. The financial management of YBI was not perfect. No operation at its scale and in its environment could be. But it was significantly more disciplined than anything Detroit's drug trade had produced before, and that discipline meant that simple asset forfeiture and financial pressure were not sufficient tools to dismantle the organization quickly. This is the aspect of YBI's operational model that most surprises people when they first encounter it, because it contradicts everything that popular culture tells us about how drug organizations work. YBI, under its founding leadership, operated with a deliberate policy of limiting unnecessary violence. This requires explanation because it sounds contradictory. YBI was not nonviolent. Violence occurred within and around the organization. Workers and competitors were harmed. People died. The drug trade is inherently violent at its margins, and YBI was not exempt from that violence. But the founding leadership understood something that most drug organization leaders did not understand, or understood but could not enforce. Violence is operationally counterproductive. Every act of violence generates a police report. Police reports generate investigations. Investigations generate informants. Informants generate prosecutions. Prosecutions dismantle organizations. The chain is direct and well documented. Organizations that operate violently draw law enforcement attention. Law enforcement attention is the greatest organizational threat that a criminal enterprise faces. Therefore, controlling violence is not just a moral question. It is a survival strategy. The founders imposed this understanding on YBI structurally. Internal disputes were supposed to be resolved through organizational channels, through management, through the hierarchy, through processes rather than personal violence. Workers who created violent situations unnecessarily were creating organizational liability, and the organization treated that liability seriously. The violence policy was not perfectly enforced. It could not be, given the environment, but it was more effective than anything else in Detroit's drug trade at the time. The result was that YBI, for a significant portion of its operational life, attracted less law enforcement attention than its size and revenue would otherwise have made possible. It was substantial. It was generating real money. But it was not constantly producing the violent incidents that would have prompted aggressive federal response earlier. There is no honest account of YBI's operational model that omits this dimension, and this account will not omit it. YBI recruited young workers. Very young workers. We're talking about teenagers, some of them barely teenagers, some of them children in the most literal sense. The documented record of YBI's prosecution includes evidence of workers as young as 14 and 15 years old employed in street-level distribution roles. This was not accidental, and it was not incidental. It was strategic in the coldest and most deliberate sense of that word. Young workers, children, had specific operational advantages from the organization's perspective. They were less likely to face serious adult criminal charges if arrested, because the juvenile justice system was historically more lenient than the adult system. They were easier to recruit in an economically desperate environment where legitimate employment was not available to them. They were often intensely loyal because for many of them YBI represented their first experience of structure, belonging, income, and status. And they were, in the brutal arithmetic of the drug trade, replaceable. If a young worker was arrested, another could be recruited quickly. The use of children as workers in YBI's operation is one of the most consequential and damaging aspects of its history. Many of those children did not become criminals as a life choice in any meaningful sense. They were recruited into an organized operation by adults who understood exactly what they were doing. Some of those children are dead. Some spent decades in adult prisons after the juvenile justice system eventually failed to protect them. Some survived and built different lives. The human cost of YBI's youth recruitment pipeline is enormous, personal, and permanent. What federal investigators eventually recognized and acknowledged in their own internal assessments was that they were not dealing with a typical street gang. They were dealing with something unusually well organized for a street-level drug crew of that era. And organizations with genuine structure are much harder to dismantle than loose collections of individuals. By the early 1980s, Young Boys Incorporated was not just operating. It was dominant. To call it the most powerful criminal organization in Detroit's history at that point is not hyperbole. It is the assessment of federal law enforcement, of Detroit Free Press investigative journalists, and of the researchers who have subsequently examined the court records and prosecution documents. YBI had achieved something that no previous Detroit drug organization had come close to: systematic, sustained, east side dominance of the heroin distribution market, operated through a management structure organized enough to sustain that dominance over years rather than months. The numbers, when they emerged in court proceedings, were significant by any measure. Federal prosecutors estimated that YBI at its peak was generating tens of millions of dollars annually. Even accounting for the substantial overhead costs of running a large operation in an illegal industry. Wages, supply purchases, bribes, legal fees when members were arrested, asset purchases. This represented substantial net income for the organization's leadership, far beyond anything that legitimate employment in their neighborhoods could have produced. What did that money look like in practice? In neighborhoods where YBI operated, the financial reality of the organization was visible and tangible in ways that created the specific, complicated community response that always attends concentrated criminal wealth in poor communities. YBI members drove cars that nobody on a legitimate East Side income could afford. They wore jewelry that cost more than houses in their neighborhoods. They ate at restaurants, wore clothes, and occupied a consumer lifestyle that was simply impossible for the overwhelming majority of their neighbors who were working legitimate jobs, if they had legitimate jobs at all, which many did not. This display of wealth had effects that were not simple. There's a long and important academic and journalistic literature about the way that visible criminal wealth functions in economically depleted communities, and a simplistic narrative that it only functions as a lure drawing vulnerable young people into crime does not capture the full complexity. YBI's visible wealth also generated local economic activity. The cars were bought from Detroit area dealers. The clothes were bought from Detroit area stores. The restaurants that YBI members frequented generated legitimate revenue. The workers who were on YBI's wage payroll, even though those wages came from illegal activity, spent that money in their neighborhoods, in corner stores and barbershops, and on rent and food for their families. None of this excuses what YBI did. The economic activity generated by the organization's spending cannot be weighed against the devastation generated by the addiction that funded it. But it is part of the documented reality of what YBI's presence meant in the neighborhoods where it operated, and an honest account acknowledges that complexity. YBI's legitimate world investments during its peak years reflected both the need to manage cash and the desire to establish presence in the legitimate economy. Real estate purchases on the East Side, houses and commercial properties bought with drug proceeds, represented a significant investment. Businesses, some of them genuine commercial operations, others primarily vehicles for moving money, were established and operated. These investments were not just financial decisions. They were signals. They were YBI telling the neighborhood, and in a different way, telling law enforcement that this organization had permanence, that it was not just a corner crew, but an institution with assets. The competitive landscape during YBI's peak years is worth examining in detail because it shows just how dominant the organization had become. Detroit in the early 1980s was not a city without other criminal organizations. There were other crews operating on the East Side and elsewhere in the city. Some of them were former YBI associates who had branched out independently. Some were independent operations that had existed before YBI and continued to exist, albeit in reduced circumstances, after YBI's rise. Some were newcomers, organizations from other cities trying to establish footholds in Detroit's market. YBI's relationship with these competitors was not purely one of violent confrontation that would have violated the violence reduction policy that was central to its operational model. Instead, YBI managed competition through a combination of economic pressure, organizational strength, and strategic enforcement of its territorial claims. Organizations that tried to operate in YBI's territories faced consequences. But those consequences were possible, managed and proportionate rather than explosive and attention-drawing. Competitors who accepted YBI's territorial boundaries were allowed to operate. Competitors who did not face escalating pressure that made operating in YBI's space economically non-viable. There is documented evidence from court proceedings that YBI at its peak had connections, some direct, some indirect, with suppliers not just in Detroit, but in other major cities. The heroin supply networks of the early 1980s connected Detroit to Chicago, to New York, and through those cities to international supply chains. YBI's volume made it a known and significant trading partner in those networks. Its reliability and organizational consistency made it a preferred customer. The supply relationships were not static. They evolved as the organization grew and as the broader drug supply landscape shifted. The cultural dimension of YBI's peak years requires careful treatment because it involves real people, artists, musicians, community members who existed in proximity to the organization without necessarily endorsing or participating in it. Detroit's East Side in the early 1980s was a culturally active place. The music scene that would eventually give rise to Detroit's distinctive contribution to hip-hop and electronic music was already stirring. The aesthetic sensibility that YBI projected, the cars, the clothes, the style, was part of the broader street culture of that time and place, and it was influenced by the artistic culture developing in the same geographic space. What can be documented is that YBI's presence created an aesthetic reference point that persisted in Detroit street culture long after the organization itself was dismantled. The style of YBI, the specific way that its members carried themselves, dressed, drove, presented, became part of the cultural memory of Detroit's East Side in a way that fed into subsequent artistic expressions. This is not endorsement. It is documentation. Culture records what it lives with, regardless of moral evaluation. Inside the organization during the peak years, the tensions that would eventually become critical were already beginning to develop. This is the nature of large organizations. The same growth that creates power also creates new vulnerabilities. The organization had grown large enough that founding leadership's direct oversight could not reach all of its operations with equal effectiveness. Middle management layers that had been thin when the organization was smaller were now essential, and the quality of those middle managers varied. Some were as disciplined and organizationally minded as the leadership that had built the organization. Others were talented operators who nonetheless struggled to maintain the discipline and violence avoidance that had been YBI's operational signature. The larger the organization grew, the harder it became to enforce the cultural norms that had made it distinctive. There were also supply challenges. The early 1980s were years of significant volatility in the national heroin supply, related to changes in international production and trafficking routes, to law enforcement disruptions of major supply networks, and to the beginning of the crack cocaine era, which would eventually redirect the attentions and economics of many drug organizations away from heroin and toward cocaine. YBI had been built around heroin distribution, and the shifting drug market created pressures that a heroin-focused organization had to navigate carefully. And there was the matter of money. Large amounts of cash generate large problems. The more money YBI generated, the more exposed its financial operations were to law enforcement scrutiny. The IRS and FBI financial investigators who eventually became central to the YBI prosecution began their work not by following drugs, but by following money. The money was always going to be a vulnerability because money, unlike drugs, creates a paper trail even when people try hard to prevent it. By 1982, Young Boys Incorporated was the most powerful criminal organization in the history of Detroit, and that made them the most consequential target the FBI's Detroit field office had ever faced. The FBI did not come for YBI because of a single event. They came because of a pattern of revenue, of reach, of organizational discipline, and of duration that eventually became impossible to ignore at the federal level. By the early 1980s, enough pieces had accumulated, enough arrests of street-level workers, enough financial anomalies, enough witness accounts, enough pure volume, that the picture of YBI's scale became clear to federal investigators in a way that demanded a proportionate response. Understanding what happened next requires understanding why YBI had been difficult to prosecute up to that point, because the difficulty was not accidental. It was structural, and the structure that created the difficulty was the same organizational design that made YBI functional. Traditional law enforcement approaches to drug organizations are built around a simple logic. Find the people selling drugs. Arrest them. Charge them. Convict them. The organization is dismantled. This approach works adequately against fragmented, unorganized street-level operations because in those operations, the people selling drugs are the organization. Remove them and nothing is left. YBI had systematically eliminated this vulnerability. The workers who were selling drugs at the street level, the people who were most visible, most exposed to law enforcement contact, most likely to be arrested, were not YBI in any meaningful organizational sense. They were employees. They could tell investigators who their immediate supervisor was. They might be able to identify the territory they worked in, but they could not tell investigators about supply chains, financial structures, organizational strategy, or any of the elements that would allow a prosecution to reach the organization's leadership. YBI's hierarchical structure, the same structure that made it efficient and durable, also functioned as a series of firewalls against prosecution. This meant that local law enforcement arrests of YBI street workers, and there were many through the late 1970s and early 1980s, had essentially no organizational effect. A worker was arrested. The worker was charged with street-level drug distribution. The worker went through the criminal justice system. Back on the corner, a replacement worker appeared. The organization's management structure was intact. The supply chain was intact. The revenue continued. From YBI's perspective, street-level arrests were an operational cost, not an existential threat. Federal investigators recognized this structural reality and began thinking about how to counter it. The solution they eventually developed drew on a relatively new legal tool that had been designed specifically for the problem of organizations that were larger and more durable than individual criminal acts. That tool was RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO was passed by Congress in 1970 primarily as a tool for prosecuting the Italian-American Mafia, which had for decades successfully insulated its leadership from prosecution by maintaining distance from the street-level criminal acts that funded the organization. RICO's innovation was conceptual. It allowed prosecutors to charge people not for the specific criminal acts they themselves committed, but for their participation in an ongoing criminal enterprise as a whole. Under RICO, the organization itself became the crime. Being a manager in an organization that committed crimes, even if you personally never touched drugs or participated in violence, could make you criminally liable for the organization's crimes under RICO's conspiracy provisions. For a YBI prosecution, RICO was potentially transformative. If investigators could prove that YBI was a RICO enterprise, an ongoing criminal organization whose members engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity, they could potentially prosecute the organization's leadership for crimes committed by workers the leadership had never met and activity the leadership had deliberately insulated itself from. But RICO prosecutions are enormously complex. They require proving the existence of the enterprise as an ongoing criminal organization, proving a pattern of racketeering activity, proving each defendant's participation in the enterprise, and connecting specific criminal acts to the enterprise's overall operation. Assembling that kind of case requires investigation on a scale and duration that vastly exceeds what a typical drug arrest requires. It requires financial investigators, organized crime specialists, long-term surveillance, and, almost always, cooperation from people inside or adjacent to the organization. The FBI's Detroit field office began building its YBI investigation with full awareness of this complexity. The investigation that would eventually result in prosecutions was not a quick operation. It took years. It involved multiple agencies, the FBI, the DEA, the IRS, and local law enforcement working in a coordinated task force structure. Each agency contributed different expertise. The DEA brought drug trafficking knowledge. The IRS brought financial investigation expertise that was essential for tracing the money flows that documented the organization's scale. The FBI brought organized crime investigative experience and the RICO legal framework. One of the most important and least publicly discussed elements of any major RICO prosecution is the development of informants. People with direct knowledge of the organization's operations who are willing to provide that knowledge to investigators. Without informants, most major organized crime prosecutions are impossible. The organizational insulation that makes these organizations hard to prosecute from the outside makes inside knowledge the only reliable path to the leadership. Developing informants inside or adjacent to YBI was not simple. The organization's internal culture, the loyalty created by the wage system, The management structure that created genuine organizational identity, the awareness that cooperation with law enforcement was the most dangerous thing a YBI-connected person could do, all worked against informant development. But the investigation did develop sources. People who had been arrested and faced serious prison time. People who had been burned by the organization in various ways. People who had family members harmed by the drug trade. The specific identities of these sources were protected in the legal proceedings to the maximum extent allowed by law, which means the historical record on this dimension is incomplete by design. The surveillance that accompanied the informant development was extensive. Wiretaps were authorized and conducted, which provided direct evidence of communications between YBI members at various levels of the organization. Physical surveillance documented meetings, movements, and associations. Financial surveillance tracked cash flows, real estate purchases, business transactions, and other financial activities associated with YBI members. The combination of these investigative streams, informants, wiretaps, physical surveillance, financial investigation, gradually assembled a picture of the organization's structure, scale, and operations that was detailed enough to support a complex RICO prosecution. The financial investigation deserves specific emphasis because it was ultimately one of the most powerful tools in the prosecution's arsenal. YBI's revenue was large and consistently generated, which meant it was impossible to hide completely. Money moves. It gets deposited, it gets spent, it gets invested, it gets paid as wages. It changes hands in ways that leave traces. IRS investigators who specialize in following cash-based illegal enterprises are extraordinarily skilled at identifying those traces and assembling them into evidence of income that can be attributed to criminal activity. The scale of YBI's financial operation made it vulnerable to exactly this kind of investigation. The estimated tens of millions of dollars annually figure cited by federal prosecutors came from this investigation. Asset inventories developed by investigators documented cars, real estate, jewelry, and business interests associated with YBI leadership that could only be explained by income vastly exceeding anything attributable to legitimate sources. The arrests, when they came in waves. The initial wave of federal indictments targeted the organization at multiple levels simultaneously, a tactic designed to prevent the organization from responding coherently to the prosecution by eliminating leadership that might reorganize or obstruct the investigation. Senior figures in the organization were taken in coordinated arrests. The timing and coordination of the arrests reflected the thoroughness of the investigation. Years of work executed in a compressed operational window designed to maximize impact. The founders and senior figures of YBI, Milton, Butch Jones, Dwayne, Wonderful Wayne Davis, Raymond, Baby Ray, Peoples, and others, were among those swept up in the federal prosecution. The charges against them reflected both their specific criminal conduct and their roles in the organization's leadership. RICO conspiracy charges that aggregated the criminal conduct of the entire organization under the legal framework of leadership participation. The trials that followed were complex, lengthy, and heavily contested. Defense attorneys mounted aggressive challenges to the government's evidence, to the reliability of informant testimony, to the admissibility of surveillance evidence, to the legal theory connecting leadership to street-level criminal acts through RICO. Some of these challenges succeeded in specific instances. Many did not. The weight of evidence assembled through years of investigation was substantial, and juries who were presented with that evidence in comprehensive form found it compelling. The convictions that resulted from the YBI prosecutions were severe. Federal mandatory minimum sentencing laws, which were becoming dramatically more punitive in the early to mid-1980s as the war on drugs intensified, meant that convictions on major drug and RICO charges carried sentences measured in decades. People who had been involved in YBI's operation at various levels, leadership, management, street work, received sentences ranging from years to life. The sentencing was not uniform and was contested in some cases on appeal, but the overall picture was of an organization whose human infrastructure was systematically dismantled through the criminal justice system and warehoused in federal prisons for years and decades. The government won. YBI was dismantled. But the streets of Detroit did not get safer. They got more chaotic. Because what the prosecution never accounted for was what happens when you remove the organization but leave the demand. We need to stop here, not to catch our breath, to pay attention. Because this part of the story is easy to skip past when you're telling an organizational history, when you're focused on the mechanics of how something was built and how it fell. And skipping past, it would be a betrayal of the people who actually lived this story. Young Boys Incorporated was not an abstraction. It was not a case study in organizational design. It was a living, operating enterprise that touched thousands of real human lives. And the way it touched most of those lives was not with money or power or belonging. The way it touched most of those lives was with damage. Sometimes with death. Always with loss. Always. Heroin addiction is not a choice in any simple or meaningful sense. The pharmacology is straightforward and well documented. Heroin, an opioid derived from morphine, produces intense feelings of euphoria and pain relief by binding to opioid receptors in the brain. Regular use produces physical dependence rapidly. Physical dependence means that stopping use produces withdrawal symptoms that are, for most people, agonizing. The combination of euphoria during use and agony during withdrawal creates a trap that is extraordinarily difficult to escape without significant medical and social support. In mid-1970s to mid-1980s Detroit, with inadequate addiction treatment resources, minimal social support infrastructure, and the compounding stresses of economic collapse, escaping that trap was, for many people, functionally impossible. The neighborhoods where YBI operated were neighborhoods where heroin addiction was already present when YBI was founded, and where YBI's organizational efficiency dramatically increased the availability, reliability, and reach of the product. More product, consistently available, at prices that YBI's operational efficiency made lower than pre-YBI prices. This is a public health crisis accelerant. More people became addicted. People who were already addicted found their access more reliable and consistent, which deepened their dependency and reduced any natural pressure towards seeking treatment. The Detroit Free Press and other Detroit area media documented the human face of this addiction crisis extensively during the YBI era and its aftermath. Families destroyed. Children growing up with addicted parents in homes that could not provide basic stability. Men and women who had previously held jobs, maintained households, and participated in community life gradually reduced to the single consuming focus of maintaining their habit. The stories are individual, and they are devastating, and they are not abstractions. They are documented lives. What those stories tell us, what the public health data from the period confirms, is that the heroin epidemic that YBI's organizational efficiency accelerated was a community-level catastrophe, not a collection of individual bad choices. A systemic public health disaster that fell hardest on the communities that were already most vulnerable, communities that had already been weakened by economic disinvestment, by white flight, by the fiscal collapse of city services. YBI did not cause the conditions that made Detroit's East Side vulnerable to an addiction crisis. But YBI made that crisis worse. Significantly, documentably worse. The children who worked for YBI deserve their own examination, separate from the broader workforce, because their situation represents a specific category of harm that is distinct from the harms suffered by adult workers who made something closer to an informed choice to participate in criminal activity. Court records from the YBI prosecution document the employment of minors in the organization's distribution network. Some of these children were as young as 14. Some were even younger. They were recruited, sometimes by older relatives who were already in the organization, sometimes by YBI recruiters who targeted young people in schools and neighborhoods, sometimes by the simple gravitational pull of an organization that offered income, status, and belonging to children who had access to none of those things through legitimate channels. To say these children made a choice to join YBI is to misunderstand what choice means for a 14-year-old growing up in Detroit's East Side in 1980. These were children whose legitimate economic prospects were essentially zero, whose schools were underfunded and overcrowded. who were watching their parents struggle with unemployment in an economy that had closed its factories and had not yet opened anything to replace them, who were surrounded by peers who were working for YBI and had money, had respect on the street, had the particular kind of belonging that comes from being part of an organization that has power and structure. Against that backdrop, the recruitment pitch YBI made to young people was not a pitch most 14-year-olds had the resources, psychological, economic, social, to resist. What happened to those children is documented in court records and in subsequent journalism. Some were arrested as juveniles and processed through a juvenile justice system that was already strained. Some were arrested later as adults for activities rooted in their YBI involvement and sentenced under adult mandatory minimum laws that took no account of the age at which they had been recruited. Some died from violence within the drug trade, from the legal and extra-legal consequences of operating in an environment where multiple parties, including law enforcement, were applying lethal force. Some survived, emerged from prison years or decades later, and have spoken publicly about their experiences with a clarity and honesty that is essential to understanding this story from the inside. Their testimony is consistent in certain respects. The organization felt real, felt structured, felt like something that belonged to them. The wage, however modest by the standards of organized crime, represented more income than anything legitimate the East Side offered them. The belonging, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself, of having a defined role and responsibility, filled a vacuum that nothing in their lives had previously filled. And then, when the law arrived, they were the most exposed, the least insulated by the organizational firewalls that protected leadership, and they absorbed the legal consequences that the system's design fell hardest on. The imprisonment of YBI members, and a large number were imprisoned for long periods under federal mandatory minimum laws, had consequences that extended far beyond the individuals imprisoned. The families they left behind, partners, children, parents, bore costs that the criminal justice system does not formally acknowledge and that are difficult to quantify, but easy to understand. Children who grew up without fathers because those fathers were serving 20-year federal sentences. Women who lost partners, sometimes to prison, sometimes to violence, and were left to manage households in economically desperate circumstances without the support structure those partners provided. Parents who watched sons disappear into the federal prison system and faced the prospect of never having normal relationships with them again. These are not abstract casualties. They are real people in real communities, living with real consequences that are as much a part of YBI's human legacy as any revenue figure or organizational chart. The specific community most affected, Detroit's East Side, was already a community under enormous stress, adding the mass imprisonment of hundreds of men from those neighborhoods. Men who, whatever their criminal conduct, were fathers, brothers, sons, and economic participants, was an additional wound on a community that had already sustained many wounds. Researchers who study the effects of mass incarceration on urban communities have documented extensively how the removal of large numbers of men from already stressed neighborhoods creates cascading effects on children's outcomes, on neighborhood economic activity, on community social structures that persist for generations. Detroit's East Side is one of the clearest examples of those effects in American urban history. What did YBI's decade-plus of operation do to the specific streets and blocks where it was active? The answer is complicated in exactly the way that any honest account of the relationship between criminal organizations and the communities they occupy must be complicated. The simple answer, YBI destroyed those neighborhoods, is partly true but misses dimensions that matter. The addiction crisis that YBI's operation accelerated damage to those neighborhoods in ways that are still visible and still measurable. Properties in areas with high addiction rates declined in value and in maintenance. Community institutions, schools, churches, local businesses operated under the constant stress of serving a population with high rates of addiction-related problems. The violence that occurred within and around YBI's operation, though managed and minimized by leadership's policy, was still real and still lethal, and its victims were predominantly people from those same neighborhoods. At the same time, And this is the dimension that the simple answer misses. YBI's economic activity in those neighborhoods represented real resources in a context of resource scarcity. The wages paid to workers were spent locally. The ancillary economic activity generated by leaderships spending circulated in the neighborhood. For some families, YBI's wages were the difference between paying rent and not paying rent, between eating and not eating. This does not justify what YBI did. It documents what YBI's presence actually meant on the ground, something more complicated than pure destruction. Any honest account of YBI's history must include Demetrius Holloway, but it must place him correctly in that history. Holloway was not where YBI started. He was a significant figure who rose to prominence within and around the YBI environment in its later years, specifically in the mid to late 1980s, during the period when the cocaine trade was reshaping Detroit's drug landscape. Federal records document Holloway's role in cocaine distribution during this period. He was part of the East Side world that YBI had shaped, operating in an environment where the organizational norms, territorial structures, and street culture that YBI had established were the baseline reality. His story is not the story of YBI's founding. It is the story of what the YBI era produced, the broader cast of significant figures who operated in the organization's orbit, who were shaped by its example, and who carried elements of its organizational culture into the changed drug market of the late 1980s. Holloway was prosecuted and convicted on federal charges arising from his drug distribution activities. The sentence he received was severe, consistent with federal mandatory minimum sentencing for major drug figures in that era. Like so many men whose stories run through this history, he entered the federal prison system and served a substantial sentence. His story is part of YBI's broader human legacy, not as its architect, but as one of the many East Side lives that the YBI era shaped. Behind every empire, every legend, every documentary, every rap lyric, there are people, real people, and most of them didn't get a TV show. When the federal prosecutions were complete, when the last major verdicts had come in and the last sentences had been handed down, Detroit's drug landscape looked nothing like it had before YBI. But it also looked nothing like what law enforcement had hoped it would look like. The hope, the implicit promise of every major organized crime prosecution, is that dismantling the organization creates safety, that removing the criminal infrastructure creates space for legitimate institutions to fill. Detroit's East Side did not experience that outcome. What it experienced was something that criminologists and urban researchers who have studied this pattern across many cities and many prosecution efforts have come to understand as almost inevitable. When you remove an organized criminal enterprise without addressing the underlying demand that enterprise was serving and the underlying economic conditions that made that enterprise attractive to its workers, you do not eliminate the criminal market. You fragment it. YBI had, for all its destructive effects, imposed a kind of order on Detroit's East Side drug market. It was a terrible order, built on addiction and exploitation and the sacrifice of young people's lives. But it was order. Territory was defined. Disputes were managed through organizational channels. Violence, though present, was moderated by the organization's explicit interest in limiting it. Workers knew who they worked for. Customers knew where to go. The market had structure. When YBI's leadership was imprisoned and its organizational infrastructure dismantled, that structure disappeared. What replaced it was not safety. What replaced it was chaos. Dozens of former YBI members, people who had worked at various levels of the organization, who had operational knowledge and street relationships, but no longer had an organizational framework to operate within, suddenly found themselves free agents in a market that was now completely unregulated. Former YBI territories became contested. Former YBI supply relationships were up for renegotiation. Every piece of the organization that had previously been managed through the hierarchy was suddenly available to whoever was willing to fight for it. The violence that YBI's violence reduction policy had suppressed erupted with a ferocity that shocked even investigators who had anticipated some post-prosecution turbulence. Detroit's homicide rate, which had already been high during the YBI years, climbed dramatically in the mid to late 1980s. Research by criminologists examining this period has documented the specific mechanism. The fragmentation of a large, organizationally disciplined criminal enterprise into multiple competing successor organizations produces a wave of violence as those successors fight to establish territorial dominance. This is one of the most important and most underappreciated lessons of the YBI story. The federal prosecution was legally successful. It convicted the people it targeted on the charges it brought, but measured by its public safety effect, the metric that law enforcement uses to justify major organized crime prosecutions to the public, the prosecution's outcome was deeply ambiguous. Detroit's East Side was more violent and more chaotic after YBI's dismantling than it had been during YBI's peak. The demand for heroin did not decline. The supply did not stop. What stopped was the organized management of that supply and demand, and the result was not peace. It was disorder. Not all of the people who had been connected to YBI were imprisoned in the federal prosecution. Some were not charged. Some were charged but not convicted. Some served short sentences and were released while the landscape was still unsettled. Some had operated at the edges of YBI's structure, in positions adjacent to the organization without being formally part of its criminal enterprise, and therefore had avoided direct prosecution exposure. These people carried something with them from their YBI experience. They carried organizational knowledge. They had seen from the inside how a large-scale drug distribution organization was built and managed. They had seen the wage system, the territory management, the supply chain relationships, the financial structures, the violence reduction strategy. They had seen what worked and what the vulnerabilities were. They had received, through direct experience, an education in criminal organizational thinking that the East Side street culture then transmitted outward. Some of these individuals went on to build their own organizations, smaller at first because the post-YBI landscape was fragmented and trust was scarce. But some of those organizations grew. They grew drawing on what the YBI era had demonstrated. The same broad organizational principles, adapted and modified based on the specific individuals involved and the specific circumstances of the late 1980s drug market. The organizational knowledge of the YBI era did not die with the prosecution. It circulated, carried forward in the practices and habits of people who had been shaped by it. This process of organizational knowledge transmission is documented in the law enforcement literature on criminal organizations. Major prosecutions regularly produce what researchers call displacement. Not the elimination of criminal activity, but its redistribution into new organizational forms that incorporate the lessons of the prosecuted organization. YBI's prosecution produced exactly this effect. The organizations that emerged from the post-YBI chaos of Detroit's East Side in the late 1980s were, in many respects, more operationally aware than the organizations that had existed before YBI, because they had YBI's example to learn from. The specific operational features that YBI demonstrated, the wage system, the hierarchical management structure, the territory management approach, the explicit violence reduction policy, became part of the common knowledge of Detroit's criminal underground in ways that shaped subsequent organizations for years. This transmission happened through multiple channels. People who had worked for YBI and were not imprisoned carried the knowledge directly. People who had observed YBI from the outside, from adjacent organizations, from the supplier networks that did business with YBI, from the law enforcement world that had investigated and prosecuted it, absorbed the lessons and applied them. Detroit street culture discussed and analyzed YBI's operation the way any community discusses a significant event that shaped its landscape. What worked? What were the vulnerabilities? What could be improved? The territorial management approach became a more common feature of Detroit's drug distribution landscape after YBI. The notion that territories were organizational assets to be managed rather than personal possessions to be defended violently was a shift in thinking that YBI had demonstrated and that survived YBI. The organizations that came after YBI operated in a landscape where territorial clarity was more expected, where organizational mechanisms for managing territorial disputes were more understood to be preferable to the alternatives. The investigation and prosecution of YBI transformed how federal law enforcement approached major drug organization cases in Detroit for decades. The specific investigative methodologies developed during the YBI case, the multi-agency task force structure, the combination of financial investigation with surveillance and informant development, the RICO legal framework applied to a drug distribution organization became templates for subsequent major prosecutions. FBI and DEA investigators who had worked on the YBI case carried that experience in subsequent investigations. The institutional knowledge about how to build a major organized crime case against a disciplined drug organization, how long it takes, what kinds of evidence are essential, what the organizational vulnerabilities are, how to develop informants in closed organizational cultures, was accumulated and retained within the federal law enforcement community in Detroit. This institutional knowledge proved directly relevant when the next generation of major Detroit drug organizations emerged in the late 1980s and 1990s. Law enforcement was better prepared. The organizational techniques were more refined. The legal frameworks were better understood. The YBI prosecution had, in an unintended but significant way, sharpened federal law enforcement's approach to Detroit organized crime, just as YBI had sharpened Detroit's drug distribution. The neighborhoods of Detroit's east side that YBI had operated in emerged from the prosecution era in worse shape than they had entered it. This statement requires some careful parsing. The neighborhoods were not in good shape when YBI was founded. They were already suffering from economic disinvestment, population loss, and institutional decline. YBI's operation added to that damage through the addiction crisis it accelerated and through the ongoing violence that attended its operation. The prosecution removed YBI, but replaced it with chaos rather than stability. By the late 1980s, the East Side neighborhoods that had been YBI's territory were experiencing multiple simultaneous crises. The crack cocaine epidemic, which was transforming drug markets across America in the mid to late 1980s, was arriving in Detroit with devastating effect. Crack is a different drug from heroin in ways that are relevant to the community-level impact. It is cheaper per dose, which means it reaches deeper into economically desperate communities. It is intensely addictive in ways that produce behavioral effects that are more immediately visible and more disruptive than heroin addiction. And the crack trade, in its early years, tended to be organized in more violent and less disciplined ways than the heroin trade that YBI had managed, precisely because the organizational lessons that YBI had demonstrated had not yet been fully absorbed into the new market context. The physical infrastructure of the East Side continued to decline. Abandoned houses, already a feature of the landscape during the YBI years, multiplied as population continued to fall, and as the financial stress of the post-prosecution era reduced both individual and institutional capacity to maintain properties. The neighborhoods that had been YBI's domain became, by the early 1990s, among the most distressed urban landscapes in America. YBI's story fed into Detroit's cultural memory in ways that are still traceable. The organization's existence, its scale, its discipline relative to what surrounded it, its specific aesthetic became part of the mythology of Detroit's East Side in the same way that certain episodes of American organized crime history become part of the mythology of the cities where they occurred. In rap lyrics, in street narratives, in the shared cultural references of people who grew up on Detroit's East Side in the 1980s and 1990s, YBI occupies a specific place. That place is complicated. The cultural memory of YBI is not purely romantic. The destruction it caused was too visible, too personal for most community members to have a purely romantic relationship with its legacy. But neither is it purely condemnatory. The organizational discipline, the scale of what was built, the specific style and presence of YBI's members, these became part of the reference vocabulary of Detroit street culture in ways that influenced subsequent artistic expression. And then, in the late 1980s, two brothers from Southwest Detroit started paying close attention to the organizational lessons of the YBI era, and to what had worked, what had failed, and what the next generation of Detroit drug organization might look like if it adapted those lessons to a changed market. Their names were Demetrius and Terry Flenory, and they were building something of their own. This is the moment the entire documentary has been building toward. You have spent the last several hours learning about an organization that most people have never heard of. You have learned how it was built, how it worked, how it rose, how it fell, and what it left behind. Now it is time to draw the connection, the documented, contextual, honest connection between what Young Boys Incorporated demonstrated and the organization that most people think is the beginning of the story. The Black Mafia family. The connection between YBI and BMF is real, but it needs to be understood correctly because getting it wrong in either direction does a disservice to both stories. The connection is not a simple case of one organization directly handing a blueprint to another. It is more organic than that and more interesting. It is the story of how organizational lessons move through communities, how a generation of young men growing up in Detroit in the late 1980s absorbed what the YBI era had demonstrated and built something new with those lessons in a changed world. To understand the connection, you first need to understand the Flenory brothers and where they came from, because the geography matters. Demetrius Flenory, who would become known as Big Meech, and Terry Flenory, who would become Southwest T, grew up not on Detroit's east side, where YBI had built its operation, but in Southwest Detroit. This geographic distinction is important. Southwest Detroit was, in the 1970s and 1980s, a different urban environment from the east side, predominantly working class, with significant Latino and white working class populations alongside black residents, organized around different community institutions and different street cultures. The Flenory brothers grew up watching Detroit from a different vantage point than the YBI founders had. But Detroit was a connected city in ways that matter for this story. The street culture, the drug trade, the organizational lessons, the reputational economy. These are not East Side phenomena that stayed on the East Side. They moved through the city. YBI, by the time the Flenory brothers were coming of age in the mid to late 1980s, was not just an active organization. It was recent history. It was the subject of street discussion, of law enforcement documentation that was sometimes discussed publicly, of Detroit free press coverage that had followed the prosecution in detail. For ambitious young men thinking seriously about how organizations worked, the YBI era was a case study, not a manual handed to them, but a set of observable lessons about what had worked, what had been vulnerable, and what a more ambitious organization might do differently. BMF, as documented in the federal proceedings that eventually prosecuted the Flenory brothers, was influenced by the organizational lessons of the YBI era. But it was also decisively shaped by its own context, its own innovations, and its own ambitions. And those differences are as important as the similarities. The organizational features of BMF that most clearly reflect lessons from what YBI had demonstrated are the ones that distinguish BMF from the chaotic, fragmented operations that preceded organized distribution in Detroit. BMF operated with defined management structure. Leadership making strategic decisions, operational managers handling regional functions, workers at the distribution level. This was not reinvented from scratch. It was the organizational logic that the YBI era had introduced into Detroit's criminal culture and that had survived YBI's prosecution as a demonstrated model of how a large drug organization should be structured. BMF took territory management seriously. The notion that geographic space should be managed through organizational authority rather than individual violence was something the YBI era had demonstrated. BMF, operating in a national context rather than a city-specific one, extended this logic across multiple cities, but the underlying organizational principle reflected the same thinking. BMF maintained financial discipline at a level that set it apart from less organized operations. The attention to money management, the reinvestment of proceeds, the development of business structures as financial management tools. These reflected organizational sophistication that the YBI era had demonstrated was achievable and valuable. But BMF was emphatically not a copy of YBI. The differences between the two organizations tell us as much about how the drug trade evolved across 2 decades as they do about BMF's specific innovations. The first major difference is the drug. YBI was fundamentally a heroin organization operating in the specific market of Detroit's East Side. BMF was a cocaine, specifically powder cocaine, organization operating on a national scale. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the drug market had shifted profoundly. The crack cocaine epidemic had transformed the lower end of the cocaine market. But powder cocaine retained a different market position, associated with higher income consumers, with the entertainment world, with a kind of aspirational energy that heroin never carried. This different product positioned BMF in a different market with different customers, different margins, and a different cultural relationship. The second major difference is geography. YBI was a Detroit organization. It had supply connections outside Detroit, but its market was the East Side and its surrounding territory. BMF went national, deliberately, systematically, and at a scale that YBI never attempted. The Flannery brothers established BMF operations in Atlanta, in Los Angeles, in multiple other major American cities. This geographic expansion was made possible by the cocaine supply chains of the 1990s, which connected Colombian production to American distribution through networks that were structurally different from the heroin supply relationships of the 1970s and 1980s. But it also reflected an organizational ambition that genuinely exceeded anything the YBI era had attempted. The third major difference, and the one most responsible for BMF's cultural staying power, is its deliberate strategy of public visibility and cultural integration. BMF did something the YBI founders had never done and had in many ways specifically avoided. It cultivated a public profile. Big Meech and Southwest T sought out relationships with hip-hop artists, with sports figures, with entertainment industry personalities. They attended events. They hosted parties. They were visible in ways that YBI's leadership had specifically chosen not to be. This was not recklessness. It was a different strategic calculation. The cultural landscape of the 1990s and early 2000s offered possibilities that had not existed in the early 1980s. Hip-hop had become a global industry. The intersection of drug money and music industry money was a well-documented feature of that era. BMF's deliberate cultivation of hip-hop relationships created both a financial infrastructure. The music industry provided legitimate seeming vehicles for money movement and a cultural identity that would ultimately outlast the prosecution. YBI had chosen obscurity as its survival strategy. That choice served it operationally. It ran longer before serious federal attention, partly because its low-profile limited law enforcement urgency. BMF chose visibility. In the short term, that visibility contributed to the federal attention that brought the prosecution. In the long term, it created the cultural legacy that survived. The star show, the documentaries, the ongoing public fascination with the Flannery brothers' story. The relationship between the YBI era and BMF is best understood this way. BMF was influenced by the organizational lessons that the YBI era had introduced into Detroit's criminal culture. The structural thinking, the territorial discipline, the financial management approach. Those lessons were in the air, transmitted through community memory and street culture by the time the Flannery brothers were building their organization. They did not need a direct handoff. They needed only to pay attention to recent history, which they clearly did. But BMF also brought genuine innovations of its own. The National Geographic scope, the cocaine market positioning, the hip-hop cultural strategy that were not derived from YBI's example and that reflected the Flannery brothers' own organizational intelligence and their specific reading of the opportunities available in their time. The YBI era gave BMF a foundation of demonstrated organizational logic. BMF built something distinctly its own on top of that foundation. The organizations were also separated by time in ways that matter. The YBI era was the late 1970s and early 1980s. BMF was the late 1990s and early 2000s. 2 decades of change in the drug supply landscape, in law enforcement capability, in American cultural and economic conditions separate the two stories. BMF was not the next chapter of YBI. It was a new book written by different authors, drawing on some of the same earlier literature, but telling a genuinely different story. Understanding this correctly, not overstating the connection, not understating it, is what gives both stories their proper weight. The YBI era shaped Detroit's criminal organizational culture in ways that outlasted its prosecution. BMF was one of the things that culture eventually produced, but BMF was its own creation, its own achievement, and its own catastrophe. The lessons of the YBI era did not create BMF. They created the environment in which BMF became possible. This question deserves an honest answer. And an honest answer begins with acknowledging what the record shows and what it does not show. Milton, Butch, Jones, Dwayne, Wonderful Wayne Davis, Raymond, Baby Ray Peoples, the men who built Young Boys Incorporated, were convicted on federal charges arising from the YBI prosecution. The specific charges, as documented in federal court records, included conspiracy and drug trafficking offenses under the federal statutes that were the foundation of the prosecution. The RICO framework that structured the case meant that the founders, as the organization's leadership, faced legal exposure for the breadth of the organization's criminal conduct, not just for their personal participation in specific criminal acts. The sentences they received were severe. Federal sentencing in the early to mid-1980s for major drug organization leadership had become dramatically more punitive as the war on drugs intensified and as mandatory minimum sentencing laws expanded. The political environment of the Reagan era, in which drug enforcement was a central policy priority and in which the severity of criminal penalties for drug offenses was increasing rapidly, meant that the sentence for someone in their position was measured in decades, not years. The founders served lengthy federal prison sentences. The specific details of their incarceration, which federal facilities, any appeals or sentence modifications, their conduct and circumstances during imprisonment, are not fully documented in the publicly available record in the way that more publicly prominent figures' prison experiences sometimes are. The criminal justice system is not a transparent institution, and the lives of the people it incarcerates are largely invisible to the public once the courtroom drama is over. What the broad outlines of their situations tell us is this: men who, by their early to mid-20s, had demonstrated organizational and operational intelligence that federal investigators acknowledged as remarkable for the context, spent what should have been the most productive decades of their adult lives in federal prison. The years when most people build careers, raise families, establish themselves. Those years were spent incarcerated in circumstances that do not allow for the exercise of the organizational thinking that had defined their public lives. There is a dimension of the criminal justice system's response to YBI that deserves examination here, separate from the question of guilt or legal culpability. The mandatory minimum sentencing laws that drove the sentences imposed on YBI members were relatively new in the early 1980s, and their design has been subsequently analyzed and criticized by researchers, legal scholars, and eventually by elements of the law enforcement and prosecutorial community itself. These laws were written to impose severe, inescapable penalties on drug organization leadership on the theory that sufficient severity would deter future criminal organization building. The deterrent effect of these laws has been extensively studied, and the research is, at best, mixed. What the research consistently shows is that the laws imposed sentences that were, in many cases, dramatically disproportionate to sentences imposed for violent crimes, and that they fell with particular severity on black men from urban communities. The founders' sentences, whatever their specific lengths, consistent with sentences imposed on other major drug organization leaders in this era, were products of this sentencing environment. The legal appropriateness of their convictions is not in question. The policy wisdom of the sentencing framework within which those convictions operated is a legitimate subject of ongoing debate in American criminal justice policy. The question of what became of them after prison, whether they were released, under what conditions, what their lives looked like after incarceration, is not clearly documented in the publicly available record. The Detroit Free Press and other outlets have covered elements of YBI's history without providing a fully updated account of the current status of all major figures. What we know is that the federal prison system maintained custody of many YBI-connected individuals for decades, and that some of those individuals have been released and have re-entered civilian life in circumstances that are, for the most part, private and not publicly documented. The viewer is inevitably left with a question that this documentary poses without answering, because the honest answer is that the question does not have a simple answer. What does justice look like for a story like this? Does justice mean the prosecution and imprisonment of men who built an organization that damaged thousands of lives? The legal system provided that. Does justice mean addressing the economic conditions that made YBI possible? The closed factory doors, the disappearing jobs, the defunded schools, the systematic exclusion of black men from legitimate economic opportunity? That form of justice has not been delivered. Does justice mean restoring the communities that were damaged by YBI's operation? Those communities are still waiting. Does justice mean acknowledging the systemic failures that made sharp minds find their highest use in criminal enterprise rather than legitimate business? We're still waiting for that acknowledgement too. Do not resolve this. Sit with it. That discomfort is the appropriate response to a story this complicated. Let's pull back from Detroit now. Let's pull back from the east side and the street corners and the courtrooms and the prison sentences. Let's look at the larger frame. Because the YBI story is not just a Detroit story. It is an American story. And what it tells us about America is something that is documented, researched, and important to understand. Not because understanding it excuses anything, but because understanding it is the only way to prevent the next version of this story from happening in the next American city. Young Boys Incorporated was, by operational metrics, a durably successful organization. This is not rhetorical provocation. It is the assessment of federal investigators who examined the organization's structure and performance. The organization identified a market failure. It developed a structural solution to capture that market more efficiently than competitors. It managed supply chains. It enforced quality standards. It developed a human resources approach, the wage system, that created workforce loyalty where none had previously existed. It managed territory. It maintained internal financial records. It generated tens of millions of dollars annually for years before federal prosecution dismantled it. Many of those elements, identifying market inefficiency, building management structure, creating workforce loyalty, managing supply chains, maintaining financial discipline, are things that business culture claims to value above most others. The cognitive capacities that YBI's founders applied to building their organization are the kinds of capacities that legitimate institutions spend enormous resources trying to identify and develop. What would those capacities have built in a different environment? In an environment where young black men from Detroit's east side in the late 1970s had access to capital, to mentorship, to legitimate market opportunities, to the educational and professional networks through which organizational talent is typically identified in American society? The question is unanswerable. We cannot run the counterfactual. But it is not a frivolous question. It is the question that the YBI story forces onto the table, whether we want to look at it or not. The answer, the only honest answer, is that we do not know. We know what the founders built in the environment that was actually available to them. And in that environment, what they built was significant by the standards that measure organizational achievement, even as it was devastating by the standards that measure community harm. YBI operated during the early years of what became the war on drugs. The set of federal and state policies, beginning in the Nixon administration and dramatically escalating under Reagan, that responded to drug use and drug trafficking with increasingly severe criminal penalties, increasing law enforcement resources dedicated to drug enforcement, and an explicitly militarized rhetoric and approach. The Rockefeller drug laws in New York, passed in 1973, were an early signal of the sentencing direction. Federal mandatory minimums for drug offenses expanded significantly in the 1980s, driven by political dynamics that have been extensively documented by researchers and historians of the period. The 100-to-1 disparity in sentencing between crack cocaine and powder cocaine offenses, written into federal law in 1986, was the most visible and most analyzed example of a broader pattern of sentencing policy that applied dramatically harsher penalties to the drug offenses most associated with black urban communities. The people who built and worked for YBI were prosecuted under this sentencing framework. The sentences they received reflected not just the criminal conduct they were found guilty of, but the political environment in which that conduct was prosecuted. The sentences were severe. The racial disparity in who received those sentences and in the communities that bore the burden of mass incarceration as those sentences were carried out is documented in research that is no longer seriously contested. The war on drugs, as documented by historians, researchers, and eventually by law enforcement figures who participated in it, did not achieve its stated goal of reducing drug use or eliminating drug trafficking organizations. What it did achieve, consistently and measurably, was the mass incarceration of black men from urban communities at rates that transformed the social structure of those communities for generations. Every drug empire exists because of demand. This sounds obvious, but it has implications that most crime documentaries ignore, and ignoring them distorts the story. Who was buying heroin in Detroit in the late 1970s and early 1980s? The easy assumption, the assumption embedded in the political rhetoric of the war on drugs era, is that the answer is the communities where the drugs were sold. Black urban communities. East Side Detroit. The buyers and the sellers in the same neighborhoods. The documented reality is more complicated. Research on heroin markets in American cities during this period consistently shows that the buyer demographics were broader than the seller demographics. White suburban consumers were a significant part of the market for heroin distributed through urban networks in this era. The drug did not stay on the east side. It moved. It followed demand, which did not respect the geographic and racial boundaries of the neighborhoods where it was sold. This matters for the YBI story because the simple narrative, black drug dealers destroying black communities, is incomplete. YBI was serving a market that was partly black and partly white. The addiction crisis, it accelerated, affected Detroit's east side most visibly because that is where the distribution was most concentrated and most accessible. But the organization's customer base, and therefore its revenue base, extended beyond those communities. The demand was not purely internal to the communities being most visibly damaged. This complication does not reduce YBI's culpability. It complicates the political and policy story around drug enforcement in ways that have historically been underemphasized. The connection between economic disinvestment in Detroit's black communities and the rise of YBI is not a theoretical argument. It is a documented historical sequence. Detroit's black neighborhoods lost factory employment. Factory employment was the primary source of economic stability and upward mobility for those communities. When that employment disappeared, the legitimate economic pathways that had previously been available closed. The drug trade, already present, now more accessible as law enforcement pressure changed, offered an alternative pathway that was accessible in a way that legitimate employment was not. This sequence, documented in urban economic research, in sociological studies of Detroit's neighborhoods, in public health literature on the relationship between economic stress and drug market activity, is not an excuse for what YBI did. It is an explanation of what created the conditions in which YBI became possible and attractive. The distinction between explanation and excuse is essential to understanding this story correctly. The policy implications of this documented sequence are significant. If the war on drugs is the only response to drug trafficking organizations, and if that response dismantles organizations while leaving the underlying economic conditions unchanged, the result is predictable. The organizations will reassemble or be replaced by new ones. The underlying demand will be served by new supply. The cycle will continue. This is not a controversial prediction. It is what the documented history of drug enforcement in American cities shows repeatedly and consistently across decades and geographies. This is not a story with heroes. It is not a story with simple villains. It is a story about what happens when a society fails its people and what some of those people do in response. Here is a question that this documentary has been circling since the first frame, and that deserves a direct answer now. Why does BMF have a Stars television show with 50 Cent attached as executive producer, with millions of viewers, with merchandise, with cultural staying power. And why does YBI, the organization that existed first, that built a model that influenced everything after it, that operated with a discipline that in many ways set the standard for what came later, why does YBI have almost nothing? Almost no popular documentary, almost no mainstream dramatization, almost no cultural presence outside of Detroit's own community memory? There are several honest answers to this question, and they operate simultaneously rather than exclusively. The first answer is timing. YBI was dismantled in the early 1980s. BMF was prosecuted in 2005. The era in which a criminal organization's story can be transformed into entertainment property was far more developed in 2005 than it was in 1982. The cable television landscape, the streaming landscape, the podcast infrastructure, the social media networks through which crime stories circulate and generate interest. None of this existed when YBI was prosecuted. The entertainment machinery that transformed BMF's story into the kind of cultural product it became was simply not available when YBI fell. The second answer is self-mythology. Big Meech understood something that YBI's founders either did not understand or deliberately chose not to pursue. He understood that a public story, carefully managed, is a form of protection and a form of legacy. By cultivating relationships with hip-hop artists and entertainers, by maintaining a public profile, by allowing BMF to become a known cultural presence rather than a hidden operational network, Big Meech was building a narrative that would outlast any prosecution. Whether this was fully strategic or partly personality is debatable, but the effect is not. BMF has a cultural life that YBI does not have, and it has that cultural life because its leadership chose visibility over obscurity. The third answer, the most uncomfortable one, involves asking questions about which stories the entertainment industry chooses to tell and which it does not. BMF got the show partly because of timing, partly because of the cultural relationships the Flannery brothers had built, and partly because of the specific creative and commercial choices made by entertainment industry gatekeepers who decided that BMF was a viable commercial property. Those choices are not made in a vacuum. They are made in a commercial environment with assumptions about what stories will attract audiences, what stories will attract financing, and what stories are worth the investment of creative resources. YBI has not gotten that treatment. Whether this documentary or subsequent work begins to change, that remains to be seen. But it is worth noting clearly that the absence of a major dramatization of YBI's story is not evidence that the story is less important or less dramatically compelling than BMF's story. It is evidence of the choices that have been made about which stories to amplify and which to let fade into court records and community memory. There's also an ethical dimension to this conversation that demands honest engagement. This documentary, the one you're watching right now, faces the same tension that every documentary about criminal organizations faces. The tension between telling an important historical story and potentially glamorizing conduct that caused enormous harm. Talking about YBI's organizational discipline can sound like admiration. Examining the founders' operational intelligence can sound like celebration. Using words like well-organized and disciplined in the context of a heroin distribution organization can sound like the beginning of a romanticization that ends with making drug trafficking seem worthy of imitation. This documentary rejects that romanticization explicitly. YBI caused enormous harm. The people it employed as children had their lives derailed by that employment. The communities it served as customers were damaged by the addiction its product produced. The neighborhoods it operated in bore costs that they're still bearing. There is nothing admirable about any of that. But there is also nothing honest about ignoring the organizational dimension of the story in order to avoid the romanticization risk. The operational discipline of YBI is not separate from its story. It is the story. It is what made YBI historically significant rather than just another drug crew. It is what made the federal prosecution necessary and complex. It is what generated the lessons that shaped subsequent organizations and subsequent law enforcement approaches. You cannot tell the YBI story honestly without engaging with the organizational features that made it what it was. You just have to engage with them in a context that never loses sight of the damage they enabled. What we owe these stories to YBI, to BMF, to the dozens of other criminal enterprises whose histories are buried in court records and community memory, is what we owe any historical truth. Honest engagement, documented facts, the courage to hold complexity without resolving it into simple hero and villain narratives, the willingness to follow the story wherever it leads, including into uncomfortable territory about systemic failure, policy consequences, and the human cost of decisions made in both the streets and the courtrooms. That is what this documentary has tried to do, and it is what this story deserves. Go back with me. Go back to Detroit. Go back to the East Side. Go back to the late 1970s, before the prosecutions, before the FBI task forces, before the courtrooms and the sentences and the slow fragmentation of what had been built, before BMF, before any of the subsequent stories that borrowed lessons from this one. Imagine a group of young men standing on the street corners of Detroit's East Side. They are watching. They are always watching. They see the cars driving past. Old cars, mostly because the money left when the factories started closing. They see the empty storefronts where businesses used to be. They see the men who used to work those factories sitting on porches in the middle of the day because there is nowhere to go and nothing to do. They see the drug trade operating all around them, chaotic, violent, inefficient, bleeding money and bleeding bodies in equal measure. And they think there's a better way to do this. That thought, that specific analytical observation, that organizational insight applied to the only available market, is the seed of everything that followed. Not just YBI, not just the organizations that took lessons from the YBI era, not just BMF, everything. The entire subsequent history of organized drug distribution in Detroit has roots that go back to those young men on those corners. Milton Jones, Dwayne Davis, Raymond Peoples, with those minds working overtime in the absence of anything better to point them at. This documentary began with a contrarian statement. BMF didn't create Detroit's drug empire. They inherited its lessons. You now know who first organized that empire. You know how it was built. You know what it looked like from the inside, the organizational hierarchy, the wage system, the territory management, the violence reduction strategy, the supply chain discipline. You know what it looked like from the outside, the federal investigation, the RICO prosecution, the convictions, and the sentences. You know what it cost, the addictions, the deaths, the children recruited into adult criminal enterprises, the families dismantled by imprisonment, the communities carrying damage they did not create and were not resourced to heal. You know the full story now. Not the romanticized version, not the simplified version, the real version. The version that lives in court records, in FBI files, and Detroit Free Press archives, and in the memories of East Side Detroit residents who watched it happen from their front porches and their schools and their churches. What do you do with a story like this? You hold it. You do not simplify it in either direction. You do not turn it into a morality play about individual choices and individual consequences, ignoring the systemic context that shaped those choices. And you do not turn it into a revolutionary romance about organizational genius operating outside an unjust system, ignoring the real people who were hurt by the system that genius built. You hold the complexity. You hold the founders of YBI as both men of real organizational intelligence and men whose choices caused enormous suffering. You hold YBI as both a remarkable operational achievement and a devastating community harm. You hold the federal prosecution as both a legitimate exercise of law enforcement authority and an instrument of sentencing policy that many serious researchers and legal scholars consider unjust in important ways. You hold all of it simultaneously without letting any part of it cancel the others. What we owe the people whose lives this story touched is this. Not a TV show, though maybe someday there will be one. Not a monument, though Detroit has built monuments to less complex figures. What we owe them is accuracy. We owe it to the young workers who were recruited into this organization as children to tell the truth about what was done to them and why. We owe it to the families who lost people to death, to prison, to addiction, to tell the truth about what those losses cost. We owe it to the neighborhoods that still carry the damage to tell the truth about what generated that damage and what policy responses have and have not addressed it. And we owe it to the men who built YBI, not as heroes and not as cartoon villains, but as complicated human beings shaped by their circumstances and responsible for their choices, to tell their story with the seriousness it deserves. Before BMF, there was YBI. Before YBI, there was a group of young men from Detroit's east side with minds that the world didn't know what to do with. History remembered them as kingpins. Maybe, but history also owes them, and everyone whose life their story touched, something more than a title. If you sat with this story and gave it your full attention, let it land the way it deserves to land. Thank you. Not as a YouTube formality, as a genuine expression of what it means to know that someone out there cares enough about an untold story to give it the time it takes to be told properly. This took real research, real time, real care. Detroit's east side and the people whose lives ran through this story deserve that research and that care. I hope this documentary honored them in the way they deserve to be honored. Now I have one ask. Just one. Think of one person in your life. One person who watched BMF on Stars and thinks the story started there. One person who thinks they know Detroit. One person who is hungry for stories that the mainstream missed. And send them this video right now, while you're still thinking about it, before the next video starts. One person, one share. That is how stories that did not get the show reach the audience they deserve. If this is your first time here, this is what we do. We find a story's history buried under more famous names. We build them out with the research and the honesty they deserve. Subscribe right now and turn the notification bell on, because the next one is already in production and you do not want to come to it late. And drop your comment right now before you click away. Did you know about YBI before this video? Where did you watch this from? And what story do you want us to tell next? The comment section is yours. Use it, and I will see you in the next one.